Welcome everybody to the RFS Three Counties Winters Lecture on this November evening, and this is being hosted by the RFS Herefordshire Division. I'm your chair for the meeting and representing Herefordshire Division as the chairman. The lecture by David Jam, the National Deer Advisor, Forestry Commission, is entitled Deer Management in England, the Forestry Commission's Current and Future Priorities. David's had a long career in forestry. Looking him up, I've discovered that we went to the same college at Newton Rigg, which is interesting. He's been a self-employed contractor. He's worked for the MOD. He's worked for Forest Enterprise. He's worked with the Deer Initiative and been with Natural Resources Wales, and comes to England in the present post as the sort of national deer advisor to the Forestry Commission in England. So I would like to welcome David to this lecture. David will bring a huge amount of knowledge and eagerness to his present role, and what we want to achieve is a balanced outcome of managing deer in the countryside and protecting our highly valued woodlands for its biodiversity without losing these important habitats to deer. Welcome, David. I'll leave it to you now to take over.
Thank you very much, Nick. Right, hopefully you can all see my title slide. Thank you very much to Nick and Simon and the RFS for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all this evening. I hope you find it interesting, and as Nick said, please take the opportunity to put your questions in the chat, and I'll endeavour to answer them all at the end. And I hope you find this interesting and insightful. Right. So I work for Forestry Commission Forest Services, not to be mistaken with Forestry England, who manage the public forest estate. So for those who aren't totally clear, Forest Services are the grants, regulation and policy side of Forestry Commission, as opposed to the public forest estate. Little bit about me. So as Nick said, I've been in forest and woodland management for most of my working life. Attended the what was then the National School of Forestry up in Cumbria at Newton Rigg. Prior to that, I had been working as a forestry contractor and working on a number of farms and estates as a forester and woodsman. In the mid to late 90s, I started my career as a forest manager, working initially for Ministry of Defence Estates, and then for what was Forest Enterprise as a harvesting forester in the east of England. So quite a baptism of fire in terms of managing a large harvesting program there. I then moved to Wales, where I worked as a silvicultural forester for a short period of time prior to being taking up a secondment with the Deer Initiative as a deer liaison officer for Central England. I had been involved in deer management prior to that, so I'd been a recreational deer manager in the east of England since my late teens. So I understood the impacts of deer, and I'd cut my teeth in terms of practical deer management. I worked with a huge number of private landowners as a deer liaison officer in Central England, and really became aware of the extent of deer and their impacts to woodlands and biodiversity, timber production during during that time, and and particularly the challenges faced by landowners who were trying to do the right thing against a whole suite of challenges. I returned from secondment and then was fortunate enough to be asked by Director for Forest Enterprise Wales to establish a wildlife function across the Welsh public forest estate, which I did and ran for around about 12 years. Then took up post as Director for Deer Initiative, which unfortunately, due to funding issues, was forced to wind up. And at that time, which was early 2020, Forestry Commission Forest Services decided that they were going to establish their own deer function, and that's where I am now. So I live in Herefordshire, which I think is a beautiful county with some fantastic woodlands, both ancient woodlands and fantastic growing ground for Douglas fir. And we have a small woodland of our own, and that's part of it in the picture there. Some beautiful oaks, but it's predominantly mixed broadly. And most of my time I spend, if I'm not at work, it's chasing around after our children and their ponies. So Forest Service objectives, it's about expanding, protecting, improving woodland, connecting people with woodlands, and increasing contribution forestry makes to the national economy. So all about grants, regulations, incentives, tree health, and improving the use of timber products in and their contribution to the economy. So obviously my role is predominantly around the protect part of the protect objectives, because obviously deer and squirrels are the two main mammal threats. I'm not going to expand on squirrels because obviously that's a huge subject in itself, but obviously very important. So within Forest Services, we have a deer team made up of myself. Have a national role, so work within the national policy team. David Hooton in the east of England, an ex Deer Initiative deer officer. Alistair Boston, again ex DI, based up in Cumbria, covering the West Mids and Northern England. And Jamie Caudry, ex DI again, working in London and the southeast. We also have Armin Siddiqui, who's ex-Forestry Scotland, and more recently worked in North York Moors for Forestry England, and he comes with a lifetime of experience too, as a forest management practitioner. And I don't have a photo of him, but Mark Malins is our Southwest Deer Officer. I work with Mark in Wales on the development of the Welsh Government deer strategy. And Mark's an accomplished forester and a very knowledgeable private woodlands officer. So that's our team. So what do I do? So my role is all about developing policy, influencing current and future policy. So anything to do with regulation, incentives, future incentives, the new grant schemes, England Woodland Creation offer environmental land management scheme, whatever that may look like when it's when it finally comes to fruition. I lead on the development of ETAP derived actions, which is the England Trees Action Plan. So out of that came the deer strategy, which I'll discuss later. And I lead the strategic direction for the deer officers. I'm not there. I don't oversee their daily work, but they work on a number of national projects for me, and obviously provide advice to ministers, answer parliamentary questions, give advice to other public bodies and agencies regarding deer. Feral wild boar also sit within my remit. They since I joined FC, they've been fairly silent, but given we have African swine fever brewing up in Europe, we may see a change in approach from government if we have any signs of an outbreak in the UK. So, setting a bit of context, where are we now? So, courtesy of British Deer Society, these are the 2016 distribution maps of the 6 deer species in the UK. As you can see, looking at roe in particular, in 2016, there wasn't a lot of white space. I haven't, the new distribution maps haven't been released yet, but they're just about to be, and I know that there's even less white space now. So roe have expanded throughout most of Wales and the Midlands. A lot of the urban conurbations throughout the central part of England now have roe living, albeit at low densities, throughout green corridors and areas such as derelict railway lines, motorway embankments, and any sort of derelict land. Roe and muntjac are doing very, very well. So Chinese water deer, if we start at the top, Chinese water deer in 2016, they were spreading throughout Norfolk. They've almost doubled their area now, I would say, in the east of England. Fallow deer, again, spreading more slowly because they're a much more hefted animal from their early areas of release, which are predominantly deer parks and old hunting forests. So fallow are doing very, very well. Although they may not fill in all of the white space, their density is increasing very, very quickly. So of all the species, we probably have higher densities of fallow in certain areas per square kilometre than we do any other deer. Muntjac, again, doing very, very well right throughout southern England, and also moving up due to human translocations into the north of England. Red deer, again, spreading very successfully because they have large territories, and also escapees from deer parks and deer farms have done very, very well since the 80s. And Sika, slightly less so, but again, small releases from deer parks and deer farms. So a little bit of a context. So that was where we are, and how did we get there? So quite obviously, we've had huge increases in woodland cover in the UK in the last 150 years, and deer have really monopolized on that. They've expanded into pretty much all new woodland. Even some of the more recent plantings, deer have moved into. So the example I always use is Kielder. So in 1919, there were almost no roe deer in that part of Northumberland. Since then, there's something like 60,000 hectares spruce has been planted there, and Forestry England now cull in excess of 3,500 deer from that forest a year. They don't think that's even taking off the annual birth increment, and they're still having to fence Norway spruce to protect it from being unsustainably impacted upon. So that's how successful roe deer are. Milder winters has helped deer, so obviously fawn survival has been very high, and with the exception of some of the upland areas like the Lake Districts, we don't really see climate related mortality in young deer. More winter cropping, there's a lot more food availability for deer, there's a lot more game covers, there's a lot more tall crops, forage, maize, miscanthus, energy bioenergy crops available for deer to use as seasonal habitat. So really, really favorable conditions. Some of the other images, obviously there's a picture of a lynx. Well, we got rid of most of the natural predators in the last 500 years. I'm not advocating the return of natural predators. Some are. I don't think it's realistic in this very, very small overcrowded island we inhabit, but perhaps I'll be proven wrong. The expansion from deer parks and private collections of deer, deer farms has had a difference, certainly in terms of red deer and fallow deer. And the image down to the bottom left of the deer stalker, to an extent, the popularity of recreational deer stalking has helped, because there are a number of deer stalkers who have historically encouraged the harvestable surplus, or managed deer to maintain a harvestable surplus, and there is some income to be gained, but in terms of the economic loss to woodlands and agriculture, it's difficult to see today how those incomes can balance against some of the losses. And we have some real examples of where agricultural, particularly agricultural and forestry losses are amounted to significant sums, sorry. And just as an example, the amount of the budget for the England Woodland Creation Offer, which is allocated to deer fencing and tubing, is 35% of the entire budget, based on risk of damage from deer. Okay, now impacts. So how do we know what's the level of impacts from deer? Okay, deer aren't causing unsustainable impacts all over the country, although in some areas the impacts are very, very high, species dependent. Some parts of the country, particularly the east of England, have 5 or even 6 species of deer, all having a different effect on woodlands, on biodiversity, on agriculture, hedgerows, amenity. So this is an example I use, this series of photographs. This is an ash woodland in the south of England, just very, very soon after a deer fence was removed, in an area of high fallow deer and a proportion of roe deer. 18 months later, after the fallow deer had moved in, they modified it to this extent. As you can see, they've browsed out anything they can, and they're starting to fray a lot of the stems. So they're starting to suffer long-term irreparable damage. And 6 years later, the site looks something like that. And that's something that we're probably very used to seeing. And a lot of the public are used to seeing woodlands in this kind of condition. And if you haven't seen woodlands like that, if you haven't been to the Isle of Wight or you looked inside a deer fence, you're probably used to seeing woodlands looking like this. And it's all part of the education process that people think that woodlands are wide open spaces, and some people like a very, very clear woodland floor. But in terms of natural regeneration, successional woodland, biodiversity, it's not so beneficial. If you're an arable farmer and you're just coming up to harvest, and you then have herding species such as fallow deer or red deer, start to use your crops as a lying up area. Obviously, modern combine harvesters can pick up so much, but there's an awful lot of issues here with crop contamination and just general yield loss and quality loss, particularly if you're growing crops for seed or extremely high value. Biodiversity, so there's lots and lots of evidence about the impact of deer on biodiversity generally, woodland structure, loss of woodland birds, invertebrates, wildflowers, and we work with a lot of organisations who are very, very well aware and collect evidence on the impacts of deer. Obviously, there are other species which impact, and there are other factors such as climate, shade, and tree disease, plant disease. So, but deer are just, we're talking about deer today, and they are an important factor in woodland condition. So the deer officers, there are 5 deer officers, as I said, embedded within the Forestry area, the Forestry Commission area teams, and their role is to advise not only internal staff, but to provide a service to applicants for woodland grants, landowners and woodland agents generally, and to the public about deer impacts upon woodlands and biodiversity. So they have a key role working with private owners, local authorities, environmental NGOs. They speak to an awful lot of owners of land about how to mitigate deer impacts, and they develop remedies for some of those problem areas, and that might be pointing an owner towards a non-lethal solution. It may be fencing or helping them to design woodlands to be less deer palatable, but very often it comes down to advising on lethal control. They also have specific national projects. So David Hooton works on venison's supply chain. Jamie Cordery works on data and evidence. Armands has a great focus on managing deer in urban and community woodlands. So they have a very varied role, and they all contribute to a greater national picture. So the woodland officers advise on woodland impacts. They advised on the use of tree shelters and more recently the use of deer repellent chemicals such as tricho, which some of you may be familiar with. It's something that we're looking to gather some more evidence on the efficacy of, because it's another tool in the arsenal to help us mitigate against damage from deer. We're also very interested in non-plastic tree shelter alternatives, because obviously spreading millions and millions of plastic tubes across the countryside is not that sustainable in the long term environmentally, and is very costly. So we're looking at all options as well as lethal control. Obviously, we're aware that using the right height tube is important for certain deer species, and that at high densities, deer and tree tubes are not a very practical combination because they can destroy them, as you can see in the picture on the bottom left. We advised on deer fencing, which for many years has been the default position for high risk areas, and the grant situation has basically meant that it's very easy to apply for a deer fence and erect it and shut the gate and walk away without having to do anything about the underlying deer population. So and often there are cases where deer fences are put up at the expense of the public purse, and they aren't strictly necessary. We also know of an awful lot of deer fences which have deer inside them within the first, well, at least within the first couple of months, if not the first 6 months, and where deer are frequently shot from the inside of fences rather than on the outside. So while deer fences have a place, we're trying to develop future incentives that provide an alternative to deer fencing, and we advise on non-woodland impacts. So we're quite heavily involved in the environmental land management scheme, and obviously that means that's part of that is paying landowners for provision of for delivery of environmental assets such as hedgerows, field margins, wildflower mixes, pollinator mixes. So that we advise on that too. We've obviously advised on planning, on woodland planning, infrastructure, species choice, high seats, etc., access routes. Advise on lethal control, the practicalities of deer management, and we deliver events to train staff on that. We also advise on data collection, best practice, shooting skills, etc. The deer officers have they have a great interest in collecting evidence and data to support their work. So to support lethal control, we need robust data, because obviously lethal control of any animal is an emotive subject. So we need impact data from sites, and we also, and it's also useful to have landscape scale deer density data, and to record that and make that available to help with resourcing and as a management tool. And this is some risk mapping that we undertook in the southeast of England to demonstrate levels of risk on a 10K from deer on a 10K grid square basis. We offer training events for practitioners and also for land managers, owners, and agents, because we know that there is a gap in terms of knowledge within the sector. So one of the things that we are very, very keen to drive forward is the development of incentives. So some of you might know that Forestry Commission this year launched a series of woodland supplements to sit on top of Countryside Stewardship Higher Tier, WD2, and one of those supplements was a deer control supplement, paying £90 a hectare for qualifying woodlands, over and above the £100 a hectare for WD2. So that's been applicants have been able to apply for that from January 2022, and we're also looking at options for other schemes, including woodland creation schemes, as well as embedding deer management payments within ELM in the future. In terms of venison, David Hooton, the deer officer in East of England, chairs an industry-wide venison group, we understand that while venison, the venison income, while it doesn't, it isn't a huge source of income, it helps to offset some of the costs of management. And of course, it's a fantastically healthy meat. You know, it's a good alternative to beef, and you know, it's in the wild. It's readily available, welfare friendly. So we're working with the wider game sector and shooting sector, as well as Forestry England and Forest and Land Scotland, to develop a brand and help with marketing. We're also commissioning a number of pieces of research. One of them is to determine the natural capital and carbon impacts of wild deer in England. So that's literally just been commissioned in the last fortnight. We're working with University of York to undertake this research and to deliver a report to us. So that should give us natural capital, carbon, and economic impacts of deer estimate for all of England, building on a piece of work undertaken by University of York about 20 years ago, which just covered the east of England. But it's long overdue that we have a better figures to quantify economic impacts, and obviously there's a great deal of interest in deer impact of carbon sequestration and impact on natural capital. So I talked about the England Trees Action Plan derived deer strategy, something I've been working on for the last 2 years. The most recent developments. The strategy draft was informed by the England Tree Strategy Consultation responses, which overwhelmingly were in support of the development of a national deer management strategy. We more recently sense-checked the draft with 10 representative public and private stakeholder groups, stakeholders, including landowners, shooting organisations, animal welfare organisations, environmental NGOs, and that led to a draft paper and a public consultation in August, which attracted over 2,000 responses. We're a little behind where we want to be because of changes in government, but DEFRA are currently analysing the consultation responses, and they will be submitting a paper to ministers in the new year. We were hoping for the paper for the strategy to be done and dusted and published before Christmas, but obviously due to situations outside our control, there have been other priorities in Westminster, so we've been slightly put on the back burner. But for those of you who aren't aware of some of the areas for some of the proposed areas for change within the draft strategy, this is the list, and it's really about developing a better suite of sticks and carrots and tools for landowners and managers to increase the level of effectiveness of management without compromising animal welfare, and without really changing primary legislations in such a way that we remove all protections for wild deer. So that's clearly not the objective. We recognise that deer are iconic in the landscape, and we also recognise that they are a source of income for some some landowners, but what evidence the evidence we have is clear that that deer are having a profound effect on new and existing woodlands, upon biodiversity and upon agriculture, as well as public safety issues such as 75,000 deer vehicle collisions a year, and the potential risk of disease spread within the wild deer population to livestock and humans, either through the likes of bovine TB or through tick-borne diseases. Although they shouldn't be overplayed, because we're not in a position now where they are a severe risk. So, just drawing to a close. I've probably gone dreadfully over time, but thank you very much for that.
Thank you, David. That was a very enlightening and quick thing through your time in Forestry England, and the policy that's evolving as we speak. And that I know we've got some questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to ask Simon if he could read out each of those questions as we go through.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, David, for an excellent talk. Yes, so starting at the first question then, from Bruce. So David here, you mentioned deer using game cover crops. In your experience, is there any conflict with pheasant shooting and deer control? There is often some complaints that there is amongst in the countryside.
Right, okay, so experience and particularly experience drawn from 20 years of, well, 19 years of the existence of the Deer Initiative, where deer officers worked with landowners, foresters, gamekeepers day in, day out. What has become apparent is that while gamekeepers very often play a part in the management of deer, particularly on estates and farms, the critical 20-week control period for female deer, it coincides with when gamekeepers are at their busiest. So there are challenges there. There are some shoots where the gamekeeper doesn't wish for anybody else to be in the woods and disturb pheasants, particularly if it's a large commercial shoot, and there are a lot of shooting days during the season. And there are issues around feeding of deer. So there was a case in the Cotswolds where there were some large commercial shoots who were putting an awful lot of feed down. There were very high fallow populations, and because those fallow were following the quads around and feeding nose to nose on the feed rides, there was a high incidence of bovine TB within those deer because the nose to nose transmission was so high. And then we've got cases in the east of England where game covers are being used by deer to such an extent that gamekeepers are having to electric fence the game covers to prevent damage. So yes, there are some conflicts.
So thank you, David. So another question here. Can you tell us what is tricho?
Okay, so tricho, now somebody's probably going to correct me here, but I believe, well, it's a product, it's a natural product derived from sheep. Now it's either from sheep, it's either the oil from sheep's wool or it's rendered down tallow. I'm not entirely sure which one, but it's some, but it produces a fatty solution which can be applied through a knapsack sprayer to trees either pre-plant or post-plant, and deer find it unpalatable, both its smell and taste. Its efficacy is still under question in terms of at what density of deer and what species is it most effective. but it definitely has an effect over and above some of the old-fashioned paint on deer repellents, which use the grit or a sand in suspension, and I think they were much harder to apply, whereas Trico is much cheaper to apply, and it seems to have quite a good repellent effect. Potentially it might have a good value in conjunction with deer control for the more palatable species. So you wouldn't have to spray every single tree. You might just spray, say for instance, your silver fir or your oak or your field maple, that sort of, your sort of more palatable species.
Okay, thank you. Could you tell us whether there are any of the different deer species are more destructive to either existing or new planting schemes than others species? Right.
It depends which part of the country you're in. If you're in the north of England, then you will be told it's roe deer. There are probably more roe deer than any other species of deer in the UK. They make up the majority of the deer culled. They also make up the majority of deer hit by vehicles on our roads. And because they're predominantly woodland species, they spend all year in the woods or on the woodland edge, whereas the herding species such as fallow, red, and sika make up a predominant part of their diet, bulk feeding on grasses or arable crops or pheasant feed. So while it's during the winter months that they cause the most damage. I suppose really, if you've got high densities of any species of deer, they will cause damage. Muntjac more so to biodiversity, so to woodland plants and natural regeneration. Fallow, as you can see in the last slide I put up, fallow in high numbers will take woodland structure, will simplify woodland structure very, very quickly, because they just eat everything during the winter. They'll just, if they're hungry, they will eat quite woody stems. Chinese water deer are predominantly grazers, and their impacts are being studied currently because of their population increase, but they're not really considered to be a high risk species in terms of woodland damage. So it's really roe are a generalist woodland browser. They tend to eat high value woodland plants, and they will browse out tree leaders. Fallow will just bulk feed everything when they're in the woods. So, and red and sika, or red particularly, are very destructive in terms of antler fraying by the males, but fallow do that too. So it just all depends on the densities. If you've got a few deer, you can keep your deer populations relatively low, you can mitigate damage. But if you allow populations to build up and you become a sanctuary, then look out.
Thank you. So what is the justification for a closed season for male deer?
Right, that's a very good question, and that was one of the questions within the consultation document, was what was asking for views on a closed season for male deer. Now, when the Deer Act was first brought onto the statute, the predominant reasons were really to protect them for sporting purposes. Reading between the lines, there is really no welfare reason. If there was ever in my opinion, if there was ever a time to have a closed season for male deer, it would be during the rut, to leave them alone when they're the most brainless and the most preoccupied with chasing females around. But the time when they cause the most damage in terms of roe deer is usually during the winter, when the males so damaged by roe during the winter, and you can't control male roe deer during the winter, or fallow bucks, fallow and red when they go into arable crops. So that's a very good question, and hopefully the consultation responses will give a clear view on a majority view. But there is very little of a welfare issue for having a male close season.
Thank you. Another question then. Would funding for very thick hedges in high fallow areas inhibit the formation of very large herds and the associated heavy damage to crops and woods? For example, blackthorn, once planted, could thicken up very naturally.
Okay, well, fallow and most deer love blackthorn and hawthorn. So while I know that there are quite a few advocates of woody scrub as a non-lethal protection method from deer, you'd have to establish those hedges in the first place in the face of the deer populations, which would require fencing. But having lived in an area with a very high fallow population, they absolutely love thorn, and anything prickly or poisonous to others, poisonous to horses or livestock, fallow deer find palatable.
Thank you. So, this question's about TB. How seriously should the risk or threat of TB be taken in controlling the spread of TB in cattle?
Okay, so TB is present in the wild deer population, and it's I've done quite a lot of work on bovine TB in deer. When I was in Wales, we did a project for Welsh Government, Office of Chief Veterinary Officer, on sampling, and we sampled. We took a great deal of samples from wild deer from the Welsh Government Forest Estate, as well as from private land, particularly in some of the high TB prevalence areas of West Wales and Southwest Wales, and we found a prevalence, and it was sort of down around 3% there. Really, where you have high deer populations, and particularly of herding species, is where the risk is greater. Where you have, and I'm not a vet, nor am I a scientist, but in the southwest of England, where there's high TB prevalence anyway, there is a higher incidence of bovine TB in the wild deer population, so Exmoor and other parts of the southwest. Generally culling deer to a level where you don't have huge concentrations of deer, where you don't have deer concentrate feeding. So as I said about that Cotswolds example, you can reduce the risk of most issues with deer by keeping them at levels where they're not causing unsustainable impacts, and that generally helps with the bovine TB as a rule of thumb in my experience. But you do sometimes get bovine TB popping up in places where you think, well, why is this deer infected? We don't have high densities. I mean, there was one wood that I know of on the England-Wales border where it wasn't particularly high density. The deer were culled quite routinely, and it wasn't unusual to pick up an infected animal there. There's been quite a lot of work in Ireland, including some papers which have demonstrated that there can be transmission of bovine TB from wild deer to cattle, which was the first time that's ever been there's ever been evidence to support that. So it's a small risk, but there is a risk, and there's obviously there's an awful lot of wildlife, including mice and birds, particularly small mammals, which carry bovine TB. So, we obviously know about BTB and badgers, but there's an awful lot of other species which carry BTB, or which can be hosts and vectors for BTB. So we're not looking to demonize any one species because we don't know enough about the wildlife reservoir, and that's what DEFRA is saying.
Thank you. So you've told us that deer like hawthorn and blackthorn, but could you tell us about the species that they find the least palatable?
It's quite a short list. Go to a woodland near you, which is full of fallow deer, and you will see what isn't impacted upon. So so if you go to a woodland in this area, in the sort of Herefordshire, Gloucestershire area, in terms of woodland plants, you will see wood spurge, which for some reason is extremely bitter to them. There's also some species of bramble which are unpalatable, which can be confusing because bramble's often quite a good indicator species for showing deer impacts. But there is a, I mean, I'm no expert on bramble species, I'm no botanist, but there is one particular type of bramble which deer find less palatable. In terms of trees, so any of our native species are palatable, including birch, but probably on a scale of 1 to 10, birch 1 being least palatable, birch and alder are down in the 1s and 2s. But as soon as you get high densities of deer, your birch and even your alder will get browsed. Particularly if you coppice alder, you'll see browsing on there. But birch, even though it's one of the least palatable species at high densities, and particularly in the uplands where there's absolutely nothing else to eat, deer will browse them. In terms of conifer, yeah, I mean, Sitka spruce, yeah, one of the less palatable species. However, at high densities, I've seen Sitka browsed to topiary pyramids at roadside by fallow deer. So it happens. It's just down to density and what alternative food sources they have.
Okay, well, I'm going to have 2 more questions before we hand back to Nick. So one is, I'm afraid we haven't covered all of the questions, but thank you all for having posted lots of interesting questions. And I'm sure that, David, you will be willing to answer any unanswered questions.
Absolutely. Yep.
Outside of this webinar, we do want to try and finish more or less on time. So one very straightforward question here: are deer stalking certificates funded under the higher tier stewardship?
That's a very good question, and I'll use that question in my discussions when I'm next speaking to the CS team. So currently, deer stalker training is not. However, it is an aspiration of ours, of my team, that that in future there may be support within grant schemes for deer training, which would include currently DSC1, DSC2. So not currently, but watch this space. I'm doing my best.
Okay, so just to finish, last question. A question from Bianca here, which I think is a good one to finish on.
Oh.
Are deer good for anything?
Yes, they're really good. They're really, really good at maintaining open space, maintaining diverse habitats. They're really good to eat. They're a fantastic part of a functioning ecosystem. They're great prey species. They're a host for all kinds of organisms, and yeah, I mean they're beautiful animals. They're fantastic. That's why, despite what we say, we're not trying to demonize them. There's a place for them in nature.
Very good. All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to hand over back to Nick. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, for reading all those interesting questions out, and for David trying to give us answers to everything. It's amazing. You know, it's a topic which is mostly on the tips of all of our tongues about deer management and how we go about deer management. And I hope tonight that everybody has sort of picked up something new, something which they didn't always understand, and will go away as a positive thing that we got to have management of deer in this countryside, and to look after our biodiversity and our longer term woodlands, which we're going to be planting and securing. So David, again, a really big thank you for all your notes, all your interesting feedback to us all, and that I'm going to close the meeting very shortly, and thank you again for inspiring us, really, and hoping that we might come back in another 5 years' time and you'll have some more positive news on those maps where we can see numbers dropping perhaps a little bit more, or better control being taken place. But no, thank you for tonight's lecture, David, and it's been wonderful, and it's great to see all the participation and involvement with the Q&A afterwards. And I welcome everybody to look at deer management in a positive light. Thank you. Have a good evening. Thank you, everybody.